I'm standing in front of the Sabarmati river. This monastery here shook down the very foundations of British Empire nearly 100 years ago. Let's go inside and find out what exactly happened here. But before that, here is a little bit of context, a short history lesson. Oxfam recently published a report where they claim that between 1765 to 1900, Britain extracted $64 trillion from India. Wait, what? 64 trillion? How could that be possible? I mean, that's enough money to carpet London in the notes of 50 British pounds almost 4 times over. How to extract wealth from a country? A British masterclass. British Empire primarily used 4 ways to generate wealth from India. Number 1. Using its land as a source of raw material while simultaneously treating its population as consumers, a market to sell goods. Number 2. Killing all the local industries by enforcing trade restrictions. Number 3. Increasing export duty to make it harder for locals to export their goods. Number 4. The good old taxation. But every empire, every ruler taxes its subjects. Why should Indians blame British for it? They even had to pay taxes to the rulers that came before them. The answer lies in taxation structure, the way they were extracted, and the way that money was spent. Before the British, Indian rulers had largely funded their regimes not by taxing cultivators and their subjects, but by tapping into the networks of trade, both regional and global. In stark contrast, the British East India Company taxed Indians usually at a minimum of 50% of income. As a result, 2/3 of the population ruled by the British in the late 18th century fled their lands. American historian Will Durant writes that tax defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising rates. Unpaid taxes meant being tortured to pay up, and the wretched victims' land being confiscated by the British. The East India Company created for the first time in Indian history the landless peasant, deprived of his traditional source of sustenance. India was treated as a cash cow. The British extracted from India approximately 1.8 million pounds each year between 1765 and 1815. Here is how Earl of Chatham described the revenues that flowed into the London's treasury. The redemption of a nation, a kind of gift from heaven. And a French ambassador to London wrote that there are few kings in Europe richer than the directors of the English East India Company. This is common salt. Can you imagine cooking food without it? People who live in tropical regions need salt for nutrition because it contains iodine. To what lengths can an imperial power like Britain go to for making profit by controlling such an essential commodity? British Empire Masterclass number 2. How to deprive people of essential commodities. Imagine building a 2,400-mile long natural barrier, a Great Hedge, completely made up of trees and shrubs, keeping it heavily protected, patrolled by as many as 12,000 men. But why? Just to make sure that Indians couldn't get their hands on salt without paying a heavy tax to the British. In the 19th century, India was far out of reach for the print media. The East India Company made sure that no one could write about the atrocities they committed. Due to the lack of written records, this great Indian Salt Hedge remained forgotten until the British writer Roy Moxham dedicated an entire book to it, titled The Great Hedge of India. This is Sambar Lake of Rajasthan, India's largest inland salt lake. The Indian subcontinent has always had enough salt to support its need via trade, but large parts of the population lived and is still living too far from the source of salt to make their own. The British exploited these geographic differences by heavily taxing salt in the areas they controlled. As part of this new business plan, they first banned Indians from producing, selling and trading salt. Then they built this Victorian wonder, the Great Hedge, to stop desperate Indians from smuggling cheaper salt from places like Sambar Lake. To build it, they chose these plant species known for their impenetrability. In its perfect form, it was 10 to 14 feet in height and 6 to 12 feet in thickness, composed of closely clipped thorny trees and shrubs. Although it was an ecological marvel, it was designed to oppress. You can see this custom line on the map as adapted from Moxham's book. Thanks to him, modern architects like Aisling O'Carroll are publishing a research paper on this topic. She appears to have found a section of the hedge in Polymath, and her research promises to uncover more knowledge of this forgotten landscape. You can read her blog to stay updated. Without enough salt, people got sick, weak and even died. Oh, and during famines when food was already scarce, the salt tax made things even worse. Millions suffered, but hey, the empire made a nice profit, so I think that was totally worth it. So the next time when someone talks about the grand innovations of the British Empire, remind them that one of their grand achievements was a giant bush that made people starve. Brilliant, right? It wasn't until 1930 that someone decided to do something about the salt tax. Many of Mahatma Gandhi's comrades, however, initially thought it was a waste of time. Jawaharlal Nehru later recalled, "We were bewildered and could not fit in a national struggle with salt." For Gandhi, the salt monopoly was a perfect example of how British loved to control everything in India, right down to the salt people ate. unfairly imposing Britain's will on even the most basic aspects of Indian life. He also realized that the salt tax harmed everyone: Hindus, Muslims, rich, poor, and people of all classes and castes. He recognized that this issue had the potential to unite Indians who were otherwise divided. 2nd of March 1930, Mahatma Gandhi penned a letter to British Viceroy Lord Irwin and made a series of requests. Among them was the repeal of the salt tax. If ignored, he promised to launch a satyagraha campaign. He wrote, "My ambition is no less than to convert the British people through non-violence and thus make them see the wrong they have done to India." But unfortunately, Lord Irwin did not offer any formal response and Gandhi had to put his plan into action. This large building of 100 rooms was used as a community living space where the disciples of Gandhiji lived. Gandhiji and his disciples used this monastery as a base to plan the Salt March. Their march started from this ashram and ended at the coastal town of Dandi. Gandhi and his followers walked 12 miles per day. Along the way, they visited many villages where Gandhi encouraged people to participate in the non-violent protest against the British. At the city of Nandiad, he targeted government servants through his speeches. He asked, "What is government service worth after all? It only gives you the power to tyrannize over others." As Gandhi and his followers inched closer to the western coastline, thousands of Indians joined them, transforming the small cadre of protesters into a mile-long procession. After walking for 24 days and covering a distance of 241 miles, Gandhi finally reached his destination on the 5th of April. Thousands of journalists and supporters gathered to watch him commit his symbolic crime. After immersing himself in the sparkling waters of the Arabian Sea, he walked ashore and found a lump of salt-rich mud and held it aloft in triumph. With this, he announced, "I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire." After him, many Indians performed the same act. Over the next several weeks, supporters across the subcontinent flocked to the seaside to illegally harvest the mineral. Women took on a crucial role. Many boiled water to make salt, and others sold illicit salt in cities. Some 60,000 people were arrested for this so-called crime against the empire, and many were beaten by police. The Salt March gave Mahatma Gandhi the kind of global recognition that was necessary to expose the brutal realities of the British India. It sparked debates around the world whether the British rule in India was justified or not. That same year, Time magazine named Mahatma Gandhi Man of the Year, and newspapers around the globe jumped at any opportunity to quote him or report on his exploits. British Viceroy Lord Irwin finally agreed to negotiate with him, and in March 1931, the two signed the famous Gandhi-Irwin Pact, which ended this satyagraha in exchange for several concessions, including the release of thousands of political prisoners. While the agreement largely maintained Britain's monopoly over salt, but it gave Indians living on the coast the right to produce salt from the sea. Many national and international leaders and thinkers came here to visit Mahatma Gandhiji. They stayed here in this guest house. National leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Rabindranath Tagore, and international thinkers such as C.F. Andrews, Henry Pollock, and Reginald Renault, they all stayed here. Madeline Slade, a daughter of British admiral, became a supporter of Gandhian thought at a very young age. She left her home in England and came here to live among the followers of Gandhiji. She stayed here for 8 years and helped in managing day-to-day activities of the ashram. Another famous Indian philosopher, Vinoba Bhave, stayed here in this small hut. This was Gandhi's home in the ashram where he lived with his wife Kasturba. Here he met many international and national personalities. He left this ashram in 1930 with a vow not to return to this ashram until India became independent. Gandhiji lived a very simple life. His motto was, "My life is my message." He practiced what he preached.